Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We got some news that I wanted to go over today. First up, the CVE program dodged a bullet today, this week in general. So with the current administration, it's pretty well known that a lot of federally funded programs have been axed. What I didn't know until this week was that MITRE is actually a federally funded organization with a contract with the government to develop and operate and modernize the CVE program. The CVE program was first launched in 1999, and it's a database where organizations can ID security vulnerabilities and have them tagged so that they can be tracked. The IDs have the word CVE in front of it, followed by a year and then a number specifically for the details of that vulnerability. And so anyone in the security industry who looks at vulnerabilities knows about the CVE program. And so this is important because earlier this week, on April 15th, a letter was leaked from the CVE board members telling the board members that the funding was in trouble and the contract was set to expire on April 16th. In response to the letter, the CVE board members announced an initiative to make a program for a nonprofit foundation where they said it would be solely focused on continuing the mission of delivering high-quality vulnerability identification and maintaining the integrity and availability of CVE data for defenders worldwide. Fortunately, at the 11th hour, Yasri Barsam, the MITRE vice president and director at the Center for Securing the Homeland, told The Verge, who was the publisher for this article that went out, that the organization was able to avoid a break in service after the government extended its contract. So as of Wednesday morning, CISA was able to identify some incremental funding to keep the program operational. Now, it's not out of the woods because the extension is only for 11 months and it's set to expire in March of 2026. So I wanted to talk about this because for me, I feel like it's extremely important. The CVE database is the world's most universal cybersecurity bug tracker. And prior to the history of the CVE program, a lot of organizations would hoard their bugs, or vendors, they wouldn't share this info, and the security community really lost out because of this. And so we were able to centralize it with this database and funded from the federal government, which is kind of a similar effort in how the CISA organization has that private-public partnership with civilian companies and civilian organizations to have that information sharing. And the CVE program, that's essentially what it is. It's being able to share that vulnerability information, have a centralized database for everyone to go to track all these vulnerabilities. Without it, it would have been pretty devastating. Want to keep an eye on this for sure. I don't know the status of the nonprofit organization, but that's also something that I think would be beneficial if it does fall out of contract with the federal government. Hopefully we can start up and support something like that, because this is a pretty critical piece of cybersecurity defense.
This was really surprising to see come across the news desk this week, except it was kind of not surprising at all, other than you don't realize all of the things that receive federal funding that are now at risk of losing federal funding. If they can transition this to not be dependent on this, that would be probably a positive thing. However, there are challenges with that. Their funding has to come from somewhere. If you can get to a model where Microsoft, Google, Apple, Meta, all the major players fund it fairly and equally, that could be potentially a good model. But you run the risk of there being infighting, power plays, Apple saying, we don't like this, we're going to pull our funding. The funding's still at risk. This is one of those things to me, and obviously this is a non-political podcast. However, to me, even in the classical conservatism sense of the government should only do for the people what the people cannot do for themselves, in a limited government type of model, this feels like it qualifies. This feels like something that is difficult to have be successful in private space and really relies on neutral government funding that's steady and continuous and not subject to the whims of different technology organizations to be most effective. So, current political landscape isn't really operating under that model. And we'll talk a little more about some other current political landscape stuff later in the show. But to me, I would just like to see them be able to identify a steady source of government funding moving forward. I am sure this is such a pittance of the overall spending of the federal budget, and it delivers so much value and return on investment. This is a good investment, in my opinion. And it's disappointing that we are cutting funding with a chainsaw right now and kind of cut first, measure second, which is the backwards order of how to do things. And I'm getting into dangerous territory here, so I'll get off my soapbox. But just to say, gosh, this is worrisome. And the thing that surprised me, Andy, is as you're walking through this started in 9. If you think of the infancy of cybersecurity, 1999, and the foresight to start this up then, which would have literally been the Clinton administration, just to give us a sense of time and space, and to have carried this forward through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, through the first Trump administration, through the Biden administration. This has survived multiple presidents from multiple political parties and has been wildly successful. And I would love to see it just be one of those things we don't have to wake up and worry about in the morning. It just, CVE is there, MITRE is funded. It is not an ongoing concern because it's just gets done and happens. So definitely concerning. Be sure to communicate stuff like this when you talk to your representation in your state house, in the federal level, and share your concerns with them. That's how things change, is when you express concerns of things like this. This puts everything at risk. Your critical infrastructure, how you get your electricity and gas every day, how transportation works, aviation, trains, automobiles. Everything is dependent on a successful cybersecurity infrastructure in the United States, and we should invest in that, in my opinion. So anyhow, we'll move on, but at least we have 11 more months of ongoing funding, and hopefully the tides shift a bit. And this is one of those things we recognize is a good investment. It's low cost, high value, high return on investment that should continue to persist moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So kind of keeping in the same theme, there was another story that broke again on, I would call it a cybersecurity incident. It's really not being classified that way or reported that way in the news. There was, it's kind of, again, no surprise that DOGE has been going to, the Department of Government Efficiency run by Elon Musk, special employee of the U.S. government. They've been going to different organizations and kind of taking a sledgehammer to them and, laying off people or asking for access to information systems and going through them. And so this has been reported. But one of the things that happened was, one of the organizations was the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB. And what this organization does, it's a really small, independent federal agency that investigates and adjudicates complaints about unfair labor practices. And it stores a ton of potentially sensitive data, from confidential information about employees who want to form unions to proprietary business information. So a lot of different things. What is different about this particular DOGE visit is that there was an official whistleblower disclosure to Congress this week. And in that disclosure, it details, technical staff members at the NLRB who are alarmed about what the DOGE engineers did when they were granted this so-called God access to the systems, and that there was particularly a spike in data leaving the agency. And they don't really know so far what type of data was leaving, but it is definitely possible that the data included sensitive information about unions, ongoing legal cases, corporate secrets, data that experts have told news outlets that should never leave the NLRB and really has nothing to do with making the government more efficient or cutting spending. And according to a lot of the internal records and communications as part of this whistleblower report, the members of the DOGE team asked for this, God access. So whatever, domain admin or full administrator, whatever it is that they asked for there. And then they also asked that their activities not be logged into the system. It appeared that they tried to cover their tracks behind them. They turned off security monitoring tools. And then they also manually deleted records of their access. So a lot of that is extremely concerning, especially when you're in the cybersecurity world. And what was even more concerning, if you can believe this story, that there's even more to it, was that shortly after they saw these data spikes, they also started seeing some suspicious login attempts from an IP address that was located in Russia. Now, they did report that those logins were blocked, but still it had some concerns because the credentials were used to try to log in and they were blocked based on the IP address. So eventually the IT department at the NLRB formed an official review of what was going on. And the whistleblower believes that suspicious activity warrants further investigation from CISA or the FBI because he believes that there may be additional breaches in the network. The labor law experts that were interviewed by news agencies said that if the data gets out, it could be abused by including private companies within cases before the agency that might get insight into damaging testimony, union leadership, legal strategies, and other internal data on competitors. And of course, there is a few cases involving Elon Musk's companies as well. So again, from an academic sense, this is obviously a textbook case of insider threat. And just as a review, is pretty common knowledge, I would say. You want to review your permissions that you're granting out, especially to contractors, the privileged permissions and admin permissions that you're granting out. And fortunately, they were able to at least track these changes in data flow, the anomalies that they were seeing. They were able to block the IP addresses that were logging in from Russia. But looking at the big picture, right, one specific data point may not be anything, just a spike in data flow coming out of the organization. But then coupled with the fact that security monitoring tools were turned off, manually deletion of activities, a suspicious IP from Russia. I mean, like all those things from a big picture standpoint paint a pretty damaging case that I would say this is a full-blown cybersecurity incident. So anyways, if you hadn't heard that, to me, it's pretty concerning what's going on in the federal government right now.
For most of our listeners, hopefully you never have an experience where the CEO tells you to start letting these other teams into your environment and give them effectively unfettered access to everything. So hopefully you don't run into scenarios exactly like this. I will just say in general, again, trying to avoid touching the third rail and overly politicizing the show, which is not our goal. I'll just say this. The government is, as the whole point of this efficiency exercise is supposed to be valuing taxpayer dollars and bringing transparency to government spending and identifying waste and bringing it to the light. If that is truly the remit of this organization, then why would they not want their steps audited? Why would they not want to be in the light themselves with the activities they're undertaking? That to me undermines the mission of what they're trying to do. And it ultimately makes it feel more like they're investigating political enemies, which the NLRB would tend to fall afoul of modern conservative politics in that they tend to side with corporations and large organizations more than individual laborers. So it makes it feel like that. And if that's not the case, there are very obvious steps they could take to make it look more open and transparent than literally trying to cover their tracks. The other thing I'll say, Andy, you did a good job summarizing some academic takeaways. Let me hit another one too. In general, you want workflows that operate on data where it already lives. Your goal should be to never have duplication of data, to have data stored in multiple systems or in multiple places. So for example, when you have e-discovery and you need to provide a copy of germane data to, say, outside counsel or opposing counsel, you of course want to make sure you're providing just what is germane to the case and just what you need to produce. What a lot of organizations will do is they will take an entire dump of the user mailbox, the entire PST file, put it on a flash drive, Azure blob storage, some unencrypted, unprotected storage means, maybe with very basic role-based access control, and provide it to someone else, probably outside counsel. You have so many sensitive emails in there. Maybe you have decrypted previously encrypted content that was protected with, say, Microsoft Information Protection, included that in the output that's being provided. Now you have an entire copy with no protections floating out there. It puts your organization at risk. It is a much better model to do the e-discovery in place on the mailbox and create a review set in place with the data in M365 and get to a place where you have pulled out only the relevant data and you are producing just that, instead of pulling out everything and doing the culling after it leaves the system. Do the culling before it leaves the system, minimizing your risk. I've had organizations argue, well, we like using Box to do external data sharing because we don't want to allow data sharing with SharePoint and bring B2B collaboration into our environment. And my concern with that model, again, is now you have two sets of data, you have two sets of policies, you have two data loss prevention engines, you have two of everything, and you have exponential more risk with that data now being duplicated. So this idea that in general, like for DOGE to do their job, they need to come in, siphon off all this data, go put it somewhere else, and then analyze it is really dangerous from a data security, compliance, cybersecurity, all up perspective. It is much better to do all of that analysis on the data where it already lives. So that can be an also takeaway for our listeners is whenever you find workflows that involve data being copied or moved somewhere else to be analyzed, find a way to do that analysis or that processing in place where it already lives and have as few of copies as possible. It will protect you in the long run. This kind of model is not a good idea and doesn't align with, best practices. Now, to be fair, that has long been the MO of how Elon has operated. He doesn't have a great deal of respect for established policy, established requirements of how to operate. He thumbed his nose at COVID requirements in the state of California, moved Tesla's headquarters to the state of Texas. When he acquired Twitter, and they were moving servers, there's little stories of them like putting them on the back of a pickup truck and driving them across town to a different data center, even though there was highly sensitive data on those servers, and not following established practices for here's how you properly shut down and move a data center. So this fits with that MO, and it shouldn't be surprising, but at the same time, we can still learn lessons from it, and we can kind of evaluate it from a distance and say, academically, here's why we shouldn't do that, and here's why we should approach it in this way instead. Now, the last thing I'll say is there's a time and a place for following all of established policy and procedure. And I understand that. There is also a time, or will be times, in which you have to move more quickly. And you have to be conscientious about the trade-offs of dotting every I and crossing every T and following everything to the letter of the law, as opposed to moving quickly. And I understand that perspective too. And there is a balance, there is a trade-off with doing that. I think this has gone too far personally with that balance, but I want to acknowledge that perspective as well, that if you see it as this is a pressing need that we must move fast on, we cannot get bogged down in bureaucracy and policy and procedure. I do understand that perspective as well. There is a balance, there are trade-offs, and it's a hard trapeze act to cross, to stay upright on the high wire act. I will say, when I first got out of college and went into IT, I saw it as a bunch of people who had created like a bunch of process around stuff that doesn't take that long, to make it take longer, to slow it down, to justify their jobs, to justify their existence. And you get a couple cocktails in me, I could still make that argument for some roles in IT today. There are a lot of things that really just slow things down, and I don't think add a ton of value. So I can understand that perspective. I just think we're a little past that point here. So, trying to avoid the third rail, but at the same time, you come to this show for commentary from me, and I don't want to disappoint. So there you go.
Yeah. And I mean, like, we're just talking about this again from an academic stance. To me, it's just concerning that instead of, they're doing all sorts of stuff with DOGE, right? But this, with the IP address from Russia and data exfiltration, disabling of security tools, I mean, like, I think this is beyond just, even if they were trying to do what they do at the other organizations, this is extremely concerning. And hopefully this is like just a one-time thing. If they do this at multiple organizations within the federal government, that would be full-blown insider threat, just really bad stuff.
Well, that's been some of the reporting has been for some of the other agencies as well, where data has been siphoned off and moved into cloud providers, and then used AI tools and cloud providers to analyze it. And I don't know if those are true, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of stuff flying around, but that's where I can say, again, going back to the academic, like, lessons learned, do your processing on your data in place.
Yeah.
And if you're gonna move it somewhere and do that with controls in place, terrific. Data duplication is bad. Just like in e-discovery workflows, in that collaboration workflow I mentioned, where they had data in Box and OneDrive, because one's for internal, one's for external. Like, I think that's a bad idea. And generally that's runs counter to how we would operate. And then finally, if you are dedicated to shining a light on government waste and inefficiency and corruption, then you should do so in the light. And you should be proud of the work you're doing and want the audit logs turned on and want all the security tools in place, because you are trying to bring light to it, not also operate in the shadows in how you operate. I think that runs counter to the goals of the organization, which on paper sound good, but we need to do that in the right way.
Yeah, and I think what's different about this particular case is, while, you know, some news organizations have reported other things happening and whatnot, this is an official whistleblower report. So someone
Yes.
is willing to go on record,
Put their name on it.
put their name, testify in front of Congress to what they saw. And so I think this makes it much more official.
Not a lot of people raising their hand to go testify in front of Congress.
Yeah.
Usually not very fun.
All right. So the final thing I wanted to put on the radar is the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, MISTIC, and the Microsoft Security Response Center, MSRC, put out an article about some exploitation of the CLFS 0-day vulnerability that eventually, in post-exploitation, led to ransomware activity. And so the CLFS is the Windows Common Log File System, and there was a escalation of privilege vulnerability that was being tracked, CVE 2025 29824, speaking of CVEs, which was fixed on Patch Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. And so through the Threat Intelligence Center and MSRC, they discovered that there was some post-exploitation of a small number of targets, including organizations in the real estate sector of the United States, the financial sector in Venezuela, a Spanish software company, and the retail sector in Saudi Arabia. And so this article is super interesting. If you go through it, there's a lot of technical detail on the pre-exploitation activity, on what the file names are when they download it, how it's built, the exploitation activity during it, everything from what bits and memory corruption that they're using to do the exploitation, where the file is located, the DLLs that are associated with it, and then finally the exploitation activity, which leads to ransomware. But what is important to me, usually when I look at these things, for sure from a kind of a defender's view, is how did the initial access happen? And so Microsoft so far hasn't really determined the specific initial attack vectors, but there are some behaviors, like the threat actor using a utility tool to download the file from a legitimate third-party website, which was previously compromised, to host the threat actor's malware, and then some post-activity for ransomware. So looking through it, there's a lot of mitigation and protection guidance. One of the things is, first of all, is to patch. And then also what I felt notable was, if you are already running Windows 11 version 24H2, you are not affected by the exploitation, even if your vulnerability was present. So not only should you patch your Windows machines, but also try to keep them up to date in the feature updates, because in this one, in 24H2, even if the vulnerability was there, the exploitation wasn't observed to be effective. So we'll put the article in the show notes, but a lot of the vulnerability stuff, as far as mitigations, it's pretty common, from general stuff. Make sure that your cloud delivered protection for Defender AV is turned on. Use device discovery with a Defender endpoint so that you get visibility into the unmanaged devices on your network. Run EDR in block mode. When we talked about running Defender with even third-party stuff, you can have it in passive mode, but you can also run it in block mode so that it can block malicious artifacts. Investigation and remediation, enable that in full automated mode, and make sure that you have attack surface reduction rules deployed. So, those are pretty general things. And then, of course, in the article itself, there's a host of things that you could do, looking at details out specific detection threats in Defender AV and MDE that if you saw this could be activity that's related to this attack. So they have a bunch of specific alerts that you could look for. There's security copilot prompts that are pre-built that you can run for looking at this. There's hunting queries that for KQL that you can look for the vulnerability for the CVE. You can look for specific IOCs associated with this attack, like the CLFS BLF file creation after exploitation, or the LSAS dump processing of the activity. So there's a bunch of queries that you can use. And then IOCs, they list out all the IOCs from the different file paths and the command line stuff that is being run that you can then do searches on. So really phenomenal report overall. I'm actually extremely impressed with this reporting. So if Mystic and MSRC is putting out stuff like this, my initial reaction is that this was a pretty serious attack, and they're seeing this being exploited in the wild. So this is something that at least you should put on your target and on your radar and make sure that you're mitigating against it.
When we talked about this in the pre-show, I made the point that for this to be on the main security blog, as opposed to just on the Mystic blog or the MSRC blog, does speak to either its prevalence or severity or both. It's already patched. It came out as part of the Patch Tuesday patches on April 8, as you mentioned, Andy, and followed responsible disclosure process. So it was not disclosed in public before patches became available, although we did see some zero-day exploitation of it. And of course, that's how we learned about it. And by the way, I keep saying we. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales business. We do this show on our own time and on our own dime, as I'm fond of saying. So since we're talking about Microsoft, I feel like I should mention that. Also reviewed the blog post. It's fantastic. You should take a look here. As long as you deployed your Patch Tuesday patches in a timely fashion, you're already protected. But you can also look for some of those indicators of compromise to see if you had any activity in your neck of the woods. And I'd be curious to know why Windows 11 H2 was not impacted by this, even if the vulnerability was present. I do know that H2 included a number of security enhancements over 23H2. If you'll recall, there were a bunch of rumors swirling before 24H2 came out about, Windows 12 is imminent, a new version of Windows is coming. And effectively, that's what 24H2 was. It kept the UI and the graphical user interface the same, but under the hood, there were a number of changes in 24H2, including significant security enhancements. So to Andy's point, although 23H2 is supported for 2 years in the enterprise, you should try to get on 24H2 sooner than later, as you do get some nice security enhancements coming with that. And of course, what we should talk about in a future show and will, you now get access to Windows Hot Patch as well, which means, 2 out of every 3 quality update cycles, you can install them without rebooting a machine, which is really cool. Although April updates will be the updates that actually do require the reboot anyways, so would not have helped you this month. Let's say another one of these comes out in May or in June. If you're on Hot Patch, your users don't even need to reboot to get the protection. So we'll touch on that in a future show, but another plug, another reason to get on 24H2, not to mention the Windows 10 and end of life, which is now, 6 months away, Andy. So you're running out of time if you haven't gotten your endpoints off of Windows 10 yet. So keep plugging away at that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information, along with the links to the articles that we used as reference for the show, will be in the show notes If you have any questions or ideas for show topics, please reach out to us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.